Okay, so when you think of ancient Babylon, what comes to mind? Towering ziggurats, right? Or maybe the laws of Hammurabi. But what about the stars? Today, we're going to dig into one of history's most important astronomical traditions and a really common misunderstanding about when it all got started.
So you might have heard something like this before. Star catalogs and planetary records are compiled in Babylonia under Hammurabi. I mean, it sounds right, doesn't it? It connects a super famous ruler with a huge scientific achievement. Makes sense. But is that actually true? This is where the story gets so much more interesting. The truth is a lot more nuanced. And you know what? It tells us a ton about how science actually develops over time. To really get to the bottom of this, we first need to travel back in time, way back, to the world of Hammurabi himself in the 18th century BCE. The first thing you gotta understand is that Hammurabi's Babylonia wasn't some primitive society. Not at all. This was a culture with sophisticated writing, highly trained scribes, and a deep, deep tradition of keeping careful records. And those right there are the absolute essential ingredients for any kind of systematic astronomy. Think of it like building a house. During this period, the Old Babylonian period, they weren't putting up the roof or installing the fancy windows. No, they were pouring the concrete. They were laying a solid, level foundation. All those later discoveries we hear about, they didn't just pop up out of nowhere. They were built right on top of this groundwork. So why were they even looking up at the sky in the first place? I mean, what was the real motivation behind this intense focus on the heavens? Well, it really boiled down to two big things. First, the practical stuff. The sky was their ultimate clock and calendar. It told them when to plant their crops, when to harvest, and how to mark the passing of the year. But there was also a really deep religious and political reason. They believed celestial events were omens, basically messages from the gods about the fate of their king and the entire kingdom.
And this shows you the two sides of the coin here. On one hand, their work was very observational. They watched the sky night after night, listed what they saw, and compared events over time. But on the other hand, it was interpretive. They weren't just collecting data for fun. They were trying to read the stars like a cosmic message. It wasn't modern science, sure, but it was a long way from just random superstition.
So if they were watching the skies so carefully, where are all those famous star catalogs? And this, right here, this is the real heart of the matter. It all comes down to a question of timing. Okay, just look at this timeline. Hammurabi is way, way back in the 18th century BCE. But the first major star lists we have, these 3 stars each texts, they don't show up until the 12th century BCE. That's a 600-year gap. 600 years. And the most famous catalog of all, the MUL.APIN, was put together even later, around 1000 BCE. This gap is the core of the whole misconception. And just so we're all on the same page, when we say star catalog, we mean something pretty specific. This isn't just a few random notes scribbled down. It's a structured, organized list of stars and constellations, and it often details their movements and when they appear throughout the year. It's a really systematic piece of work. The MUL.APIN, that's like the gold standard for Babylonian astronomy. It's incredibly detailed, but it's the product of a much later, more developed time. Historians are really careful to distinguish between the beginnings of this astronomical tradition and the fully surviving systems like this one. All right, so let's put all the pieces together and build a more accurate history. It's not about taking credit away from Hammurabi's time, but about giving it the right kind of credit. Let's go back to our house analogy, because it works perfectly here. Hammurabi's era poured that foundation, the disciplined scribal habits, the culture of observation, and a really powerful system of mathematics. Then, the later periods came along and built the structure on top, compiling all that collected knowledge into the amazing catalogs we have today. And we have to talk about that math for a second. The Babylonians used what's called a sexagesimal system, which is just a fancy way of saying it's base 60. To us, with our base 10 system, that sounds weird. But for calculations, it was an absolute superpower. It all came down to this one number, 60. This was their cornerstone. Why? Well, because 60 can be divided by so many other numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, which made handling fractions and complex astronomical calculations incredibly efficient. And here's the wild part. This isn't just some dusty old history lesson. You use this system every single day. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. every time you check the time, you are using a system that has its roots in ancient Mesopotamia. How incredible is that? So the big lesson here is really about how science itself grows. It happens in stages. First you observe, you watch the world carefully, then you record what you see meticulously over long periods of time, and only then, after all that work, can you start to systematize those records into formal theories and catalogs. Hammurabi's era was absolutely crucial for those first two steps. Okay, so let's break it down. What do we know for sure? We are certain that Babylon had a world-class astronomical tradition. What's reasonable to assume? That Hammurabi's era was a key part of its early growth. And what's not certain at all? That the most famous star catalogs were actually written under Hammurabi himself. So, if you want to sound like you really know your stuff, the most careful, historically accurate way to put it is this. Under Hammurabi, Babylonia already had the scribal and observational culture from which later star catalogs and planetary records developed. It gives that era its proper foundational importance without overstating the case. And that kind of leaves us with one last big question, doesn't it? It's so easy to connect a famous name with a famous achievement. But how many other historical facts that we take for granted are really just the first chapter of a much longer, more complex, and frankly, a much more interesting story?